Hello, everyone. Welcome to this side event, Inclusive Sustainable Economic Transformation. I am Wenyan Yang. I'm a staff of the Division for Inclusive Social Development. I'm honored to moderate today's discussion. And let me just say that the background to this hybrid event, that our world is facing multiple crises, right? And we know that we are not on track to reach the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we really need to take urgent action to get back on track. From our experience and also the lessons we have learned from the pandemic and addressing climate change and other challenges, we know that we really need to transform the patterns of economic growth. We really need to have our economy to be more inclusive, more sustainable within the planetary boundaries, and we really need to take action to implement this transformation. Yes, urgency is there, but however, how do we do it, right? This is well, it's not just multi-million-dollar question. It's the question that would lead to answers to our very existence on this planet. So I think today's event is going to be a very interesting one, and I welcome colleagues and friends who are joining online as well as in person. And I also want to say that at the outset, we have a very distinguished panel who is going to make presentations today, and also I'm very aware that we have very limited time. So as the moderator, I'm going to beg the forgiveness of our distinguished panel. So when I introduce you, I'm not going to list your professional accomplishments. I'm just going to tell our audience your position and your current affiliation. So I just want to put that up front to save some time, to leave time for discussion. And also, if you have, especially for colleagues joining online, do use the Q&A function to pose questions as we move along, and I promise I will try to monitor the Q&A box and also paying attention to the people in the room and try to give everybody opportunity to join the discussion. So with those words, I am very pleased to give the floor to Daniela Bass, who is the director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And Daniela would make her opening remarks. And Daniela, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And I also want to thank Win Yang and Jonathan and Marta, actually, who are amazing colleagues, for having helped me to share what I'm going to share now. So thank you very much. And what we would like to share with you is that we know that the world made significant progress, ladies and gentlemen and excellencies, to improve the lives of people through the Sustainable Development Goals. They are a roadmap, and it's very clear in which direction we have to move. Even though we have noticed that the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda, were already off track before the crisis of the past 2 years that the world faced. And I'm referring here about the pandemic. And more than the pandemic, and I will explain what I mean by that. We have noticed, therefore, that the pace of decline in global poverty has slowed, and the number of people suffering from hunger increased and rised. So when it comes to climate change, this was also occurring, and it is still happening. And this anticipates different kinds of inequalities, as social, environmental, and economic. And these kind of inequalities continue to increase in most countries. And meanwhile, changes in the world of work, the globalization, the technological breakthroughs, raised also the aspiration of a better world, if you wish, but also fears, and left many people unable to rely on work to provide economic security. We have to make sure that there are the skills that people need in order to be able, therefore, to live in this fifth, if you wish, industrial revolution. And then, of course, we have the events of the past 2 years, as I mentioned, with their glossy, uneven impacts. The pandemic that wiped out more than 4 years of progress on poverty eradication, pushing something like 93 million more people in extreme poverty by the end of this year, 2022. In extreme poverty in 2020, and then more, unfortunately, will increase in terms of poverty and suffering, therefore, of hunger and inequalities by the end of this year. And the first rise in global poverty, we saw it was in 1998. However, if we do not change the trajectory and make sure that we find solutions, we implement those already existing, and maybe we try to find also innovative ideas to overcome what's happening in the world in the various dimensions, inequalities and poverty will definitely, unfortunately, increase. Just look at the prolonged school closures that put something like 24 million learners from primary school to university levels at risk of not returning to school. And then the war. There are many wars in the world, as we know, but let's focus on the one that, most people are talking lately, and I'm referring to the war in Ukraine. This has caused food, fuel, and fertilizer prices to skyrocket, disrupted, and still does, supply chains and global trade, embroiled financial markets, fueling the threat of a global food crisis. And as countries look to get the SDGs back on track, there are very important lessons, though, that we can learn from these recent setbacks. Not least the importance of pursuing coherent policies that integrate and balance the three dimensions I mentioned earlier of sustainable development, which is the topic of today. So, COVID-19 showed that without access to social protection, workers have to choose between their health, and that of others, of course, and economic hardship. And that our public services, from education to healthcare to housing, are only effective if they reach everyone. So, today's energy and food security crisis is demonstrating, and has already demonstrated, that dependence on non-renewable sources of energy is a recipe for disaster. Therefore, let's look forward. Now, if we look forward, governments and other national stakeholders remain central players in creating a more equitable and sustainable societies, actually. And countries must prioritize job-intensive recoveries that are people-centered and environmentally sustainable. There is a huge opportunity to create millions of decent jobs, from health and education, or green jobs that expand the economic security to many more households. So, promoting equal access to opportunities. This is something that we have always to keep in mind, including good quality public services. For instance, social protection, that they have to be available to all, and addressing prejudice and discrimination that are also essential elements. So, by increasingly clear now in the one's country's actions. And taking care of the climate change and focusing on it at international level, and looking at the climate change issues to international migration, for instance, from transnational crime to international trades. All of this has costs and benefits for other countries, and none of these issues can be addressed unilaterally. So large gaps in well-being and opportunities within and among countries are a national as well as a global problem, demanding integrated multilateral solutions. And the roadmap laid out by the SDGs is clear. So when we take action to strengthen social protection systems, improve public services, and invest in clean energy, for example, then we address the root causes of increasing inequality, environmental degradation, and climate change. So today's meeting is a great opportunity to discuss this integrated approach in more detail. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from your experiences, keeping in mind that next year, in September, there is going a summit that will focus on the SDGs. So all of these contributions of today are actually going to feed in this very important process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for really setting setting the stage for this for today's discussion. And actually this morning at the second committee general discussion, I think the delegates also expressed similar sentiments and the desire and the need to look for solutions. I actually took notes. One of the delegates said, in this session, we need to look for solutions. So now let's now move to the panel discussion. For the following discussion, we have three very distinguished presenters. We have Professor Andrew Shepard, who is the director of the Chronic Poverty Advisory Network of the Overseas Development Institute. And we have Ambassador Surya Chandawangsi, who is the permanent representative of Thailand to the United Nations. And we also have Ms. Shara Razvi, who is the director of the Social Protection Department of the International Labor Organization. So we will hear their presentations, and then we'll have interactive discussion afterwards. So the first presenter will be Professor Shepard. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. How do I get this on the screen?
Okay. Oh. No, it's not end slideshow. We should start slideshow, right? Judy. Sorry.
Oh, there it is. There it is.
It's what's there.
Oh, it's there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right.
Very good. Thank you very much for the introduction, Wen Yang, and thanks also to the director for, especially for, and thanks to the division actually for developing this joint event between DESA and ODI. And thanks very much to Daniela for her introductory words. So in the context of the SDGs, as Daniela has mentioned, I think there is quite a lot of interest in the links between the different SDGs, a growing interest, let's say, and perhaps also a growing interest in joining up some of the discourses that relate to each of the separate SDGs. And bearing in mind that the SDGs cover many different areas, social, economic, environmental, political, that joining up can be quite challenging. And what I'm going to present is a reflection on some joining up which we have been doing at ODI across different teams at ODI, trying to develop a joint approach to understand how it is that we could develop a better landing zone, let's say, for policy across these three areas, and particularly focused on the question, can economic transformation be achieved in a more sustainable and more inclusive way than it currently is? So that's the kind of question that we're addressing and trying to bring different specialities, different specialisms to bear on it. So we have sociologists, we have economists, of course. We have people focused on environmental issues. So what we have done is an analysis of indicators at the global level, and I'll come on and talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We've identified some of the relative successes, and we've tried to go a little bit deeper into understanding how those successes were achieved. We've started to work with partners in several countries to observe what are the issues involved in that country in terms of joining up these different policy agendas. We've started some thematic work, including investigating what's happening in the garments industry, which is a labor-intensive industry, employs lots of people. What about the sustainability issues in the garments industry? It's been a very important source of growth and transformation. We're also analyzing the extent to which decent livelihoods can be achieved for people at the bottom of the distribution within planetary boundaries, as you mentioned. And then we're trying to use all of this to develop a theory of change. So I'll go into the indicators that we've been thinking about. And the graph that you can see is a sort of a summary of this work on indicators. I'm not going to go into the technical detail, but it shows that there are, this is taking low-income countries and middle-income countries, and it shows that there are several groups of countries, clusters of countries, which have performed differently across the indicators that we have been looking at. So we have a bunch of indicators which reflect economic transformation, including growth, diversification, labor productivity, a bunch of indicators which reflect inclusion, which include poverty reduction, multidimensional poverty, inequality, the SIGI, the gender index, and a bunch of indicators which reflect on environmental sustainability as well. And in terms of countries performing well, we can see that in Group B of these countries, we've got countries there which are doing moderately well across the three indicators. So in a sense, that's potentially a very interesting group. In the other groups, we tend to find that countries will do well on one or two of the objectives, maybe on the social and the environmental, but not on the transformation side. So not on the third, not on all three. So some of the countries in Group B, then, are quite interesting to look at. We'll go on and just have a slightly deep dive into some of these successes. What we found when we looked at the Dominican Republic, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, these are the countries that we've looked at to start with. And basically, we've started with literature work, surveying the literature. We're going on now to do some sort of primary work, some key informant interviews. We found that development pathways were typically additive. So all of these countries focused on economic growth over several decades. Later on, particularly in the 1990s, countries began to focus a little bit more on inclusion, and more recently on the environmental sustainability issues. So we found that this is, at least across these countries, but possibly across a wider set of countries, and this may be sort of internationally valid as well, that there's been a bit of a sequence, an additive sequence there. And we've found also that crises can also be a reason, a trigger for the development of a more joined-up approach and a change in direction in development planning. So in Thailand, for example, it was the financial crisis of the late 90s. In Sri Lanka, it was the emergence from civil conflict. In the Dominican Republic, it was the rewriting of the constitution. I have to make sure that I've got the yes. So some additional findings are that when you get a new approach to joining up investment or policy or actions, if you like, quite often this happens in an experimental way somewhere in a country. So maybe in a region or in a particular sector, and then that becomes adopted more widely as a strategy in the country. So the routes to the center of power, how do joined up approaches get to the center of power? Experimentation seems to be there are different routes, but experimentation seems to be quite important in that process. So I think this is something to bear in mind in terms of actions that you can take out of this. Experimental actions in joining up can be really important. And a second finding, even from these countries which are performing relatively well, the outcomes, we don't see yet triple win outcomes. We do see countries joining up policies, but it takes time before the outcomes are achieved. And so we haven't got countries that are achieving on all three fronts very strongly as yet. And just taking a few implications out of this, legislating policy is necessary, but it's clearly not sufficient, fairly obvious point, to achieving the outcomes. And there are challenges to the implementation. So there may be inertia. People are fixed in their ways. Institutions are fixed in their ways. Data may not always be available to the extent that you need it, and this is something that we've found in terms of doing our indicator analysis. We couldn't necessarily get the indicators for many countries that we wanted to get. Then, I've already mentioned that policy experiments are needed in order to get these changes accepted at the center of power. And sometimes there are vested interests that need to be overcome, and you need strategies to deal with those. It may be in the private sector, it may be in the public sector. And there are examples, and I think Thailand is an example, where if you engage apolitical voices, so voices which are not directly in politics. So in Thailand, it was the case that the king was quite instrumental in beginning to introduce ideas which were across this nexus back in the 1990s. Apolitical voices can be quite important. In the Dominican Republic, it was a number of donors, external donors, who introduced some of these more joined up ways of thinking. So the sources of the joining up, if you like, can be different. So we are then also working with partners in a number of countries on a number of issues which are related to the nexus. And I'm just reporting here on Kenya, where we've particularly focused on devolution as an opportunity to join up these areas of policy, because if you're sitting in a county in Kenya, you have all the relevant professional groups around you. You're there, and you have a governor who wants to advance the interests of that particular county. So in theory, devolution could be a very good way of joining up the implementation of these policies. What have we found in Kenya? Well, we found, first of all, that it's policies coming from the environmental side, so climate-related policies, which are the most joined up. Economic transformation and inclusion policies are slightly less joined up, typically, than the environmental ones. And perhaps that's because the environmental ones have come most recently, possibly. But also the environmental ones are less well-resourced than the others. So policies on economic transformation in particular are much better resourced, but the environmental ones are better joined up. Interesting contrast, I think. Some policies start very joined up, but as you go towards implementation, they get less joined up as people begin to, different organizations compete over resources. The large private sector in Kenya seems to be quite environmentally sensitive, more so than it is inclusive, perhaps because it's regulated. So I think, the importance of regulation and the ability of private sector actors to respond to regulation is very important. And then just a small finding that counties may be a little bit small to deal with many of the issues, particularly environmental issues which cross county boundaries, and you need a higher level of government. So there are increasing efforts in Kenya to develop regional approaches. I mentioned that we were doing some thematic analysis. We have done some work on climate finance, and we've found that some of the multilateral climate funds align pretty well with these three environmental, social, and economic goals. They have good conceptual frameworks, but they need multi-level actions. So they need actions at national level, at local level, at household level, in order to, and different partnerships as well. And all of that can take time to build. So this is related to the third point on the slide, which is that implementation delays have led to a lot of frustration and also limits on the extent to which we can do ex post analysis to see what the results are, because the implementation has been very slow. Even though the climate funds go back to the 2000s, implementation has been quite delayed often because of these complexities, I think. We've also done, I didn't mention them, I think I mentioned the manufacturing study earlier. We haven't got results from that yet, so that'll be coming out later. We've also done a study asking the question, to what extent can decent livelihoods, especially for the people at the bottom of the distribution, be developed within planetary boundaries? And this is very much at the moment preliminary findings, but we have found that there are significant inequalities in per capita spending, not surprisingly, I think we all know that, and also related to that in greenhouse gas emissions. So across the world and within countries also, significant inequalities, and I'll show a graph which illustrates that in a moment. We've also found that it's possible to improve the incomes of people in the lower consumption segments without emission-intensive options. So we've found that there is a great variety of the way in which people earn their living and the extent to which that involves emitting, per capita emissions, if you like. So there are options for earning your living which involve less per capita emissions, and so we're deducing from that it may be possible to improve incomes without necessarily increasing emissions. And then this is getting quite complicated, at least for me, but the emissions required to move the bottom half of the global distribution to the next lowest group, for example, to the next quartile, is relatively low. So moving the bottom half of the global distribution located in low-income countries up to the next quartile is low and can be offset by moving the top, for example, could be offset, I mean this is modeling, could be offset by moving the top quintile in Europe down a bit, yeah? And if I just show you the graph here. So this graph shows inequalities in greenhouse gas emissions across populations in different categories of countries. If you just look at the right-hand bars, and this is from two different sets of data, so that the graph is roughly comparable, but not completely comparable, as between low-income countries, middle-income countries, and the five bars of the graph on the right-hand side, which represent high-income countries or one or two upper middle-income countries. So the 5 bars on the right are basically from Europe. So it doesn't include North America, for example, or Australia, which would present a slightly different picture, a significantly different picture. What I was saying earlier was that the people who are at the bottom of the distribution, you've got the lowest group there in low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and upper middle-income countries. It doesn't take much in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for them to move up. And, if you add it up, you can do some moving down, some reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which we need to do very significantly in the richer countries, and particularly moving the consumption of the wealthiest people in the high-income countries, and to some extent in upper middle-income countries as well, moving them down a bit. You can easily create the room for the incomes at the bottom of the distribution to grow. So I think that's, of course there are still very complicated political challenges in all that, but it's good to know that. Something else that we've looked at in this program of work is the effects of COVID-19, but I suspect that I'm running away, time is running away, so I need to wrap up, yes. Right. So perhaps I'll move forward just very briefly to the fact that we are trying to, alongside these various pieces of research that we're doing, we're trying to develop a theory of change. We haven't got very far with that. I mean, there is a paper on the website if you want to have a look at it. But some of the ideas are here. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the constraints in terms of joining up policy may be to do with individual values and the choices that people make. And this may be related to the discipline that they're from. They're an economist, or they're a sociologist, or it may be related to other more personal issues. Institutional arrangements are really important, and some of the institutional obstacles might include where you have professionals working in silos, disciplines working in silos, as mentioned. Unequal power relationships across ministries. And I mentioned the fact that environmental ministries are often less powerful than others, and there's a need to equalize that a little bit. And economic ministries are typically remain predominant. Inertia is also a major factor, and path dependence. So perhaps we need to, going forwards, we need to challenge the typical trajectory of focusing first on economic transformation, secondly on inclusion, and thirdly on environmental sustainability. Innovation is a really important aspect of this, both institutional and technological, not surprisingly. And of course there are limits on innovation. Research and development budgets may be limited, public-private networks may be limited. Institutional innovation can also be limited. For example, adopting an industrial policy can be an extremely controversial issue in a country. However, we've come across at least, and the pandemic has generally led to a reduction, I think, in innovation and a reduction in joining up of policy. Governments have gone back to what they consider to be basics. They need to recover the process of economic growth. So whether it's inclusive or not, whether it's sustainable or not, becomes a secondary objective. That's something that we've noticed. I'd be interested to see if the UN has also noticed that. Nevertheless, and the pandemic hasn't really been led to much innovation in terms of joining up. Nevertheless, there are cases, and one that we've recently come across and been doing a little bit of work on, which I'm not sure whether the ambassador from Thailand will discuss, is Thailand's Bio-Circular Green Economy initiative, which seems to be, and this came up, I think, during the pandemic, seems to be quite a radical departure from the structures and relationships which have previously developed around industrialization in Thailand, paying much more attention to environmental sustainability as well as digital investment to ensure competitiveness in a greener world. And we're very interested to hear, what drove this and who drove it. But that's an example of where you have had innovation coming out of the pandemic. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew. Your research is so interesting and fascinating. Even at the preliminary, the messages you have shared, I think is extremely useful and interesting. So now let's hear from Ambassador to see if we can learn more from the experience of Thailand, and I don't know to what extent to pick up what Andrew had posed as a question. Ambassador, you have the floor.
I'm sorry. Ambassador is not here yet. Can you to the next speakers before? Thank you.
There's Shara.
Yes.
Yes, you are ready. So now we can move to your presentation.
Okay, but I'm good with that, Wen-Yan, if you want to change the order.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I think actually we have here I see that you are the next speaker. My bad.
No worries. You want me to go now, or
yes,
then wait?
Yes,
okay,
please.
No worries.
Yeah,
I'll be happy to do that. So without wasting more time, let me just first thank you, Wen-Yan, and thank you, Endesa, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and it was great to hear Daniela and Andrew before. And so if I can maybe just ask our colleagues who have the PowerPoint slides if they could just keep them handy. So I'd like to maybe just bring us back a little bit to some of the context that I think Daniela was also referring to, in which we find ourselves, and share some thinking from a new initiative that has been an initiative of the Secretary General's, and the ILO is leading on it, which is really to support recovery efforts through integrated, maybe I should use the language of a nexus, through a nexus approach to jobs and social protection policies in order to facilitate inclusive and just transitions. Of course, employment and social protection, we realize, are only part of this larger story that can tell us about a country's overall development trajectory. But given the fact that our time is limited and the focus that we have has been on employment and social protection, let me limit it to that area. So if we can go to the first slide, please. I'd like to say a little bit about the kind of the interlocking crisis. I'm not going to repeat what was said, but maybe just highlight the fact that one of the things that I think the pandemic made very clear was, first of all, it was the fact that obviously, as was already mentioned, was the decimation of jobs and livelihoods from which countries have not yet recovered. And, the last ILO monitor on jobs really showed that this recovery was happening in high-income countries, but much, much less so in middle and low-income countries. So we're having this very divergent recovery process. But also at the same time, what the pandemic also did is that I think it exposed in a very cruel way the fact that more than half, according to our data, 53% of the global population has absolutely no access to any form of social protection benefit, including many of those who are working in the informal economy. And many of these people are not even, the very, very poor who would get social assistance. So they're part of what we call the missing middle. They're not poor enough to qualify for social assistance, but not and certainly very vulnerable and don't have access to kind of private insurance and private provision. And then again, adding to that, I think over the past 7 months, there was already reference to some of the fragilities in the global food and energy systems that we have seen. But again, I think what is really problematic with this cost of living crisis is that not only have wages and incomes not kept up with the price rises, but also people who rely on social protection. Very often the benefits that are being made available are not, according to the data that we have, for more than half of the countries, there's no indexation to inflation. So the value of the benefits, are being eroded, even for those who have access to social protection. And that, of course, is adding to the rising debt burdens that countries are having with the changes in monetary policy globally and the shrinking fiscal space. So a very daunting policy landscape. And let me also say that according to our latest ILO estimates, in terms of the job recovery, also what is happening is that there is a growing shift towards more informal forms of work in the recovery, as well as a very uneven recovery from a gender perspective for multiple reasons. Women's employment is not recovering at the same pace as men's. I don't have time to go into the details. So this is the context that's really calling for a renewed collective effort to tackle the root causes and the structural constraints and to better manage and eventually really be able to exit from these crises and to ensure that the benefits of globalization or development as we know it are more equally shared both within countries as well as across countries. And also be able to really have the policies that are needed and the support systems that are needed, in particular social protection, to enable for the very difficult transformations that have to be done in terms of shifting countries to more environmentally sustainable forms of production, to make sure that these shifts happen in a way that are inclusive and people who are losing jobs are able to reskill and to have some form of income security through unemployment benefits and so forth, to be able to make that transition socially sustainable and politically sustainable. So let me just move to the second slide now, if we can, to say a little bit about the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions. Now, I think being very conscious of the fact that today's crises demand a comprehensive and coordinated response, the accelerator, which was launched by the Secretary General in September of 2021, is really a UN-wide and multi-partner response. So bringing together UN agencies with the ambition of also bringing together at the national level also some of the multilateral development banks and international financial institutions for really a much more concerted and seamless support to countries to be able to put together integrated policies and strategies that can help them overcome the decent work deficits and to really facilitate these just transitions through investments in decent jobs in the sectors where we think there are prospects of creating more jobs and ensuring that the jobs come, with the kind of social protection that is needed, and to really have a common roadmap to drive these changes forward. The ambition, I'm not going to go into all the details, but really is to create, we think there's potential for creating, 400 million decent jobs, especially in the green, in the care, and in the digital economy, and to be able to really extend social protection to the more than 50% of the global population that does not have access to any form of social protection, and be able to really equitably manage the different transitions that are pending, in particular the environmental ones, which we know are going to have winners and losers. So we really need to be thinking about the kind of systems that we need to make these transitions more inclusive and less politically contentious. The accelerator has three main pillars of action, with the first pillar that is really about this policy nexus, to use the ODI language, integrated policy support to countries that request it. So the idea is really to have countries that will ask for the kind of technical support that the UN system, several technical agencies can provide. And second, to lay out also the financing that is needed and potential sources of financing to be able to implement the policy reforms. And a third pillar, which is really about growing the international knowledge base around international development and having the kind of multilateral support that is needed for this cooperation. Let me just focus, and we can move to the next slide, primarily on the policy support pillar and specifically on how we see the employment and social protection policies, in a way being integrated for creating greater synergies and enabling the policy changes. So if we can go to the slide on exploring policy linkages, so we can kind of see, this is a very abstract exercise, the policy linkages that we can find between social protection and employment. And the arrows here represent the kind of policy cause, and the corresponding text to their right or left represents the resulting effects. So if we just look, for example, at employment, ideally creation of decent employment opportunities, first and foremost, of course, it provides wages, and this can affect social protection by reducing the demand, for example, for social assistance or anti-poverty programs. But at the same time, employment and its sort of activities with that can increase tax revenues and allow for additional investment by governments in expanding social protection. Another employment area which can be very effective and very important is around labor inspection and enforcement of labor laws. These efforts to ensure compliance, not only for proper declaration of wages and work hours, but compliance also with social security obligations by the employers, can bolster the coverage of social insurance schemes to workers who are legally eligible and also help expand the contribution base. And similarly, we can see by investing in jobs in key social sectors of the economy, it's possible to also impact the supply side of social protection and ensure that enough qualified social or care workers are able to meet the demand for social protection among beneficiaries or the service users. And now, conversely, we can also see how social protection related policies can impact on employment. For example, when you're extending the reach of contributory social insurance scheme to workers who are in the informal economy, very often this involves changing some of the rules, for example, for eligibility and benefit schedules that meet the requirements of particular groups of workers who are in the informal economy. And one co-benefit of this, in addition to being able to enjoy protection against risks that workers are then able to use, sickness benefits and so forth, is that it can also incentivize workers to formally declare wages and hours worked and bring those who participate out of the shadow and into the view of labor legislators, government statisticians, and in turn policy makers. And social protection can also support household consumption, including when used as a crisis response measure, as we saw very clearly during the pandemic, which in many cases can also help sustain economic activity and really pull the economy out of a deep recession. And the income security enjoyed by households, including many poor and vulnerable households who would receive some of the social benefits, would also allow them to take additional risks and trigger investments in creation of new small and medium-sized enterprises, and by extension, create employment opportunities. I could go on, and there's a next slide which really tries to sort of think about these kind of interlinkages, looking at the care economy. I don't know how I'm doing for time, Wen-Yan, if I can maybe say a few words on the care.
You can say a few words, concise, and then we.
Thank you. I'll be brief.
Yeah, just maybe.
Also look at the.
In less than a minute.
Okay. So I think, here within the context of care, we can also see a theory of change with employment and social protection policies support, really linking to address structural issues that affect the care economy. And this could, for example, mean that we move from a fragmented care sector with very few and underqualified workers, health workers, care workers, and a strong sort of reliance on unpaid care of family members, really to be able to move through investments in the care sectors to having not only the creation of decent jobs, but also reducing the time allocated by unpaid family members, with a positive implication in terms of the availability of their time, for labor force participation, and many of the social kind of benefits that would come from having the kind of bolstered, healthcare and childcare and other care services. Not to mention the number of jobs, and I think there's been quite a bit of work done by the ILO as well as others in terms of the job creation potential of investments in the care sector. And let me just finally very quickly move to this question around financing, because as I said, this is a very important pillar of the accelerator. And the effort here really is about supporting and helping countries through technical policy support to really help in the effort of domestic resource mobilization, both through the expansion of contributory social insurance systems and their extension to millions of workers who are working in the informal economy, as well as technical support for exploring different ways of mobilizing resources through progressive taxation. And we can say a lot more there about the benefits of that, both in reducing inequalities as well as expanding and strengthening state capacity, and also really building that public trust in a state that is responsive once the resources are able to bolster the social protection system and the public services that would be provided, creating a virtuous circle of greater willingness to pay taxes and transfers for these kind of benefits. I won't go into the dimension.
Shara, I'm sorry to jump in.
Stop here.
Thank you so much for sharing the very interesting example of the global accelerator and the example of the care economy. Now I am pleased to give the floor to Ambassador. And thank you so much, Ambassador, for your patience. And now you have the floor.
Sawadee krap, and good afternoon to Madam Moderator, dear panelists. It's a hectic day, as you can imagine. And I apologize, wasn't been able to join since the very beginning, having been at the General Assembly, and I have to go back there in a little while. But I'm always happy to work on this very important issue, on inclusive, sustainable economic transformation, which in our view is really has to do with inclusive and sustainable development. And so I would like to share some thoughts with you, if I may, and to thank the previous speakers who have spoken before me for their insights. Let me phrase from the very beginning, all right? Sustainability, inclusivity, people-centered approaches, it's part of Thailand's DNA. And for those who followed Thailand's economic transformation and supporting policies in the last 4 or 5 decades will understand that at some, these 3-4 things are reflected not only in our policies, but in terms of our thinking and in terms of how we engage people and communities in taking things forward. So what has happened in Thailand, I guess since the end of the Second World War? The Thai economy has transformed away from, as you know, from agriculture to industry over half a century. And we have witnessed, like many other countries, a rapid modernization of the economy. A lot of it has to do with trade. A lot of it has to do with investment. But one of the negative externalities, as we all know, is the detrimental impact on the environment and also on society. So by the 1980s, the environmental impacts from our industrialized economic growth accelerated. And Thailand was facing with various issues that many other countries face as well. Environmental issues, deforestation being one of them. Our natural resources were increasingly used to support this population growth. We exploded. I still remember my father telling me in the end of the Second World War, we were like about 17 million people. We're now about 70. So our income gaps, especially between urban and rural areas and within each of the two areas, are getting wider. And this has resulted in the unequal levels of access to public services. This is a problem that we've been facing for quite some time. In Thailand's case, the change came along with, as we all know, the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which basically forced us to rethink a lot of things, to rethink the way we think, to rethink the way we do business, to rethink the way we should run the economy. And it shifted us more firmly on the path of sustainability. And I said initially, sustainability is in our DNA. But this had made the issue even more urgent with the Asian financial crisis. It was a lesson in that unbalanced and unsustainable growth is unsustainable. So in the effort to rebuild our economy, the government and people realized the need to revise our development concept, as I mentioned. And then we turned to what was called the Sufficiency Economy Philosophy, or SEP for short, which was conceived by our former king, His Majesty King Bhumibol Adulyadej the Great. And this was, it began really in the 70s and was formalized in the wake of the 97 crisis. The SEP stresses the balance in the use of economic, social, environmental, and cultural capital. And so we, as a nation, began to shift away from a growth orientation to more of a people-centered development approach. The SEP provided guiding principles for Thailand's 5-year development plans and policies, and of course now incorporated into our current 20-year national strategy. And therefore, with that concept of sustainability being institutionalized in our both short, medium, and long-term national plans and strategies, it became even more necessary to ensure that these approaches are continuous and implemented and followed up. It required a nexus thinking, as the panel has discussed, in terms of our development planning. We have to engage everyone for the long term, all right? Not just for a couple of years, before elections, not a function of promises to elections, but as a well thought out process of engagement that endures, across the decades. At least 20-year strategy is 20 years, 2 decades. So sustainability has been at the heart of the SEP, and attempting to create sustainability with balance in the 4 dimensions of life in this approach, which is economic, environmental, social, and cultural. And in our view, this complements the core commitments of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which also emphasizes balance and integration between the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, environmental. In broader terms, the SEP's focus on promoting human development, which is something we're very much involved in, through a people-centered approach, and this is very much in line with the agenda, with the agenda's commitment to leaving no one behind. Okay, so second, now we come now to the COVID pandemic, which, in our view, accelerated a lot of things that we had planned to do to enhance our resilience and sustainability of our policies and our economy. And partly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we therefore built on the SEP, as I mentioned earlier, to develop something even more concrete and more looking to the future. And that is what we call the Bio-Circular Green Economy approach, BCG. And I'm very thankful that this has been mentioned and referred to in the discussion so far. Designed to create much needed balance between 2 things, the human factor and the planet factor. So people-centered, yes, but also it has to be planet-centered. And this is therefore designed to ensure sustainability and human security, another concept that we are a champion of. So the BCG model strives for more inclusive and sustainable growth while minimizing impacts on the environment. We do it by leveraging on technology and biodiversity to achieve a more sustainable and healthy economic growth and prevent societal and environmental degradation. It also addresses challenges from planetary crises that we all refer to, climate change, through developing more effective circular business models and promoting sustainable production and consumption patterns. All right. So we had the SCP, my first point, the BCG, a more modern development, building on the foundation of the SCP. And third, to bring it all together, we have to engage in what's called nexus thinking. That is what we've been talking about. And we need to create an enabling environment that allows and fosters this nexus thinking to take place. Because if we don't do that, we won't be able to get, across the board support. And if we don't get across the board support from a lot of our policies and thinking, then obviously it won't be sustainable. So that is why we are, like several other countries, involved in not only a whole of government approach to promoting sustainable development, inclusive development, but also a whole of society approach. And for those of you who are familiar with Thailand, we have a very active civil society sector, and we are proud of that. And this includes also academia, includes various institutions that have thought about and promoted sustainable development for so many years. And so on the government's part, the successful implementation of the Sustainable Development and 2030 Agenda, we need a strong institutional foundation. And we established, therefore, as part of the effort to implement this nexus thinking, is established a National Committee for Sustainable Development, which is chaired by the Prime Minister as the primary mechanism to consider relevant policies to promote balanced national development, incorporating the 3 pillars of sustainable development, as well as the 17 SDGs. Now, the 17 SDGs are incorporated into our national economic and social development plans. And therefore, it's this committee that will approve the SDGs roadmap to ensure that our national efforts to achieve the SDGs advance in one unified direction, and of course complements our regional efforts within ASEAN and APEC. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And also, of course, at the global level with regard to the SDGs. Let me talk a little bit about more. We know that these national efforts, we're a small country. We may be the second largest economy in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but we're a small country in economy. So we will have to propagate somehow this sustainability approach and thinking at the regional level. And I was privileged to have been chair of the ASEAN chairmanship in 2019, and we spearheaded, after about 6-7 years of preparation work, we spearheaded the inculcation of the sustainability vision within ASEAN. We adopted this document in 2019, and it has been now basically mainstreamed into how ASEAN approaches the development of its ASEAN community building process. And we do it in partnership also with the United Nations, and that is why we have what is called the Complementarities Initiative. In fact, that is the first, as far as I know, according to the World Bank and some of the other institutions we talked to, the first region-wide effort to link up or to find complementarities between regional development efforts and attaining the sustainable development goals. All right, so it's linking the regional global nexus, so to speak. And in APEC, by the way, we are the host economy of APEC, and therefore the sustainability and the BCG idea is very much part and parcel of our chairmanship agenda. And we hope to be able to adopt important initiatives and concrete outcomes to advance sustainability within the APEC. That's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Framework. It's broader than ASEAN. It involves the Asia Pacific. But you notice what I've said in both the regional and global level, we need partnerships. Sustainable development cannot be pursued without partnerships. So we have taken the initiative in SDGs localization, forging cooperation with all sectors at national, community, and local levels. We've also promoted cooperation with all sectors within the country and with development partners abroad. And we thank the development partners of ASEAN and oral dialogue partners that have lent a hand in promoting sustainable development and inclusive development through a nexus approach both within Thailand and within the region with ASEAN as a whole. And so we will continue this partnership at the international level, regional level, and locally with the private sector, academia, civil society, youth, and international development partners to advance the SDGs. For us, if you may have heard of three-dimensional chess in science fiction, for us, it's not two sides of the same coin. It's three sides of the coin, if you can imagine that. It's what's done at the local level, national level, to promote inclusive and sustainable development through nexus approach. It's the same side of the three-dimensional coin with the regional level. We need regional support. We are a small country, and that's within ASEAN and APEC. And then the third side of the three-dimensional coin is the global level, which is the SDGs, and that's why we're very active. I was vice president of ECOSOC just a couple of months ago, and this is something that we've been trying to promote. So to conclude, Madam Moderator, I'm taking up so much time. To achieve inclusive, sustainable economic transformation and attaining SDGs, we have pursued local, homegrown approaches while adhering to international agreed goals and standards and supplementing them with efforts at the regional level. Now, the three-dimensional coin sides have to go together. The SCP has triggered the nexus thinking in Thailand's development pathway, while the BCG economy model, together with this enabling environment that we're trying to promote, continues to carry forward our efforts towards a sustainable future. And so these are small best practices that I'd like to share with you and to reaffirm Thailand's commitment to promoting enhanced cooperation in achieving the SDGs. We take the Secretary General's of UN's call very seriously to rescue the SDGs. And of course, one of the ways to do that as a small country is to try to pursue it locally at the regional level and to make our small contribution at the global level when we can. So thank you very much for your attention. And my apologies if I have to leave early to continue the deliberations at the General Assembly on a very important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Chandawangsi, and thank you for sharing Thailand's experience. And it's no small achievement, if I may say, what your country have accomplished. So thank you very much for sharing it, and also thank you for your personal support to our event and in your busy schedule to find time to participate and share your insights. And we understand that you had to leave for your next meeting in the GA. Thank you very, very much. And at this point, I don't see any particular question addressed to you, Ambassador. So thank you. Have a good afternoon. Oh.
You can stay for a couple of minutes if there's a question. I'll
yes,
that,
we
please.
do have a question addressed to you, Ambassador.
Sure.
Good afternoon, His Excellency. How are you?
Hi, I can't see you, but I hear you.
Oh, okay, great. My name is Gail Davis. I worked with your predecessors, Plasai and Bidavas, with the SCP philosophy.
Yes.
And so I've worked between NGO status and also diplomatic status. SCP is actually the answer to solving the Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to know, how can we turn SCP into a model that can be retrofitted to fit across every country based on that country's needs, since every country has a different set of needs. But I've always known that the SCP philosophy could solve and would solve the Sustainable Development Goals way before 2030. So how could we retrofit it?
Thank you very much for the question and for the kind words and thank you very much for the cooperation you extended to my two predecessors. I think the key words, the how to retrofit, I think the word you use, I think what I'd like to draw from, the most important thing I'd like to draw from is actually what also you just said, which is you very well know that the various conditions of the various countries, even amongst the developing countries, are so diverse. And so it's the SCP fully recognizes there's no one size fits all. And that's why we use the word philosophy, not plan, not strategy, not policy. It's a philosophy. So it's a way of thinking which it will be up to the various countries to try to find the best fit. And from the very beginning, I assure you, the SEP, the sufficiency economy philosophy, is by no means, shall we say, in the international context, prescriptive. We're not trying to prescribe anything, and this is something that we've been working on, and we can share this, and we want to share this with those who are interested. But it's by no means, a part of our effort to try to say that this is the only way, the only path forward. So we've been very careful and humble, and we share on the basis that if you are interested, we're happy to do so. If you're not, that's okay too. So that it's that soft approach, I think, that we've been trying to apply, and in many ways, that's how it has been successful for quite a number of countries that have engaged with us and have tried to apply the SAP to their respective needs. So I dare not say that the SAP is a encompassing answer to the multidimensional and diverse challenges that various economies face, but in our Thai soft approach, it is something that is on the table, but we won't even put it on the table if you don't want it. So it's okay. So it's not prescriptive. It is something that I think with this soft approach, sharing some of our practices, sharing some of our vision, and implementing it through concrete projects that bring incredible benefits, we think, at the local level. I think that's how we will win the hearts and minds of those who would, we think, benefit from it. And this applies, back to the nexus thing, this applies to all our engagements. Did you know, for example, our peacekeepers participating in UN missions, formerly in Timor-Leste, that once we had a contingent there, and now in South Sudan, they are trained to not only keep the peace, but to help teach sustainable agriculture, for example. Going to the village and communities to try to teach what are some ideas of practical sustainable agricultural techniques, with the hope that their presence will be long-lasting in terms of the techniques shared, and that is very much sustainability in practice. So we try our best. Thank you for the vote of confidence. We will try to share this with as many countries as possible, but only if they are interested. And if they're not, we're okay with that too. We'll just show by example, and we've done it at the regional level. At least the good news is that the BCG, for example, is being incorporated in ASEAN's economic thinking in some projects, and we hope to use this soft sharing approach at the APEC when we are hosting the leaders meeting in November. So fingers crossed, and thank you again for your support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I know you had to leave. Just want to ask if you have time for one more question from Professor Shepard. Yes?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador, and appreciate your contribution today. My question is hopefully simple. You mentioned that the adoption of the SEP was driven by the financial crisis in the late 90s. And I'm just wondering if you could say what has driven the adoption of the BCG, who's behind it, and what reactions have been, for example, in the private sector? Thank you.
A very relevant question. Thank you. I think going back to the SCP, it was formalized, so to speak, and became much more, promoted during the financial crisis. But the SCP has been around for a while, and as I referred to initially, our former King, His Majesty King Bhumibol Adulyadej, the great, espoused this philosophy in different projects. All right, in different projects, His Majesty spearheaded, for example, the alternative development projects that we had in the hill tribe areas, which was very instrumental in transforming what was originally a drug problem into a substitute crop bonanza, which helped develop the economies in our rural areas and the hill tribes areas, for example. So the SCP has been around for a while, but we really formalized it. It became very much part of the national thinking with the challenge that we faced in the financial crisis. Sometimes it takes a crisis to get things going, Professor. Let me say on the issue of the BCG, what we have seen is that the pandemic helped accelerate thinking, but the ideas were already afoot as to how we further implement the SCP into something more concrete and in the more modern context. And so a lot of people have been driving this. Thinking is really within the government initially, but now we know that we cannot do it alone. And the private sector is almost taking charge in terms of the sustainable production practices and trying to integrate BCG thinking into their production processes. And as I said earlier, of course, we're also doing it at the regional level because we cannot do it alone. We're a small economy. So bits and pieces, Professor, step by step. This is the Thai way. We build on, learn from we learn from lessons, and we adapt to crises, and we try to make the best of those opportunities and link it up with what we see as a confluence, a congruence of thinking with the SDGs at the global level. So that's how we do it, and we hope this will continue and develop fruitful outcomes. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much. You have been so generous with both your time and your expertise. On behalf of everybody, thank you so much. And all the best to the approach in Thailand. And we look forward to seeing great results and hearing further sharing of experiences from you and your country. Thank you so much. Now, I don't see any questions. Actually, I don't see any questions online. So I would open the floor for those of us who are in person in the room. If anybody have, and I also have to say that Shara also had to leave. So now, if you have questions, I mean, of course, you can reflect on the whole discussion, but questions probably more geared towards Professor Shepherd. Martha, yes.
Questions. Andrew, thanks so much for the presentation, and to the other presenters too, but they are not here anymore, so thanks you, and Daniela. Two questions. You mentioned the predominance still of the economic ministries, Ministry of Finances or whatever, within governments, right? I was wondering if in your work with countries you have seen anywhere a change in mindset of ministers of finance in the sense of being better informed or acknowledging at least the social or environmental dimensions of their decisions, or not?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think as I mentioned, particularly in the cases that where we've been doing these deeper dives, ministers of finance have acknowledged the inclusivity dimension, probably for some decades now, and have allocated resources. Whether those resources have been enough for the job may be another matter, but public resources have been allocated. Perhaps more recently on the environmental sustainability side. And I think now my feeling would be that the cause of environmental sustainability more generally has been, the profile of it has been raised by the issue of climate change, and it's no longer possible not to acknowledge it as a Minister of Finance, or it's very difficult to refuse to acknowledge it. However, it doesn't necessarily mean on that issue that the resources are being allocated as one might look for if you want these more even distribution of results and outcomes. So I think there's still, on the environmental side, there's still, probably on the social side too. I mean, we have only to think of the battles of the social protection agencies to get enough funding, the battles of education ministries to get enough supports, out into the remote rural areas and so on. So clearly there are deficits on both of these issues, but I think perhaps particularly on the environmental one, there are still deficits, very strong deficits. Yeah. The environment doesn't get a vote, so I think it's probably an example. I mean, both of them are examples where you're unlikely to achieve that more balanced set of outcomes without considerable pressure, without considerable activity from civil society, from social movements, and from the international level and so on. So, I mean, these are very interactive dynamics.
Marta, do you have a second question? Or?
No, but go ahead.
I would like to ask a follow-up question. I just wonder, if I noticed that some of the deep dive countries, in addition to Thailand, you have Kenya. You're doing some work in Kenya. I just wonder, in countries where tourism is a very important foreign exchange earner for the economy, is there any kind of greater awareness or greater attention to the environment? Because like people come to Kenya for safari, and if you destroy the environment, you are terminating that source of income. So I just wonder if there's have you noticed any difference in terms of the finance ministry or the economic ministers paying heed to the environmental concerns?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I think we could take back and do some investigation of. But certainly what you do get where tourism is really important is a stronger protection of certain areas. So if certain areas are particularly significant, you get more resources put into implementing those protections, I think. But it would be very interesting to see if there's a wider effect. So that's a hypothesis, which we can test. High levels of tourism income lead to greater allocation on environmental sustainability.
Right.
We'll test it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Professor, if I may ask, I'm a big proponent of the SCP philosophy. I've done a lot of work with Thailand, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the SCP philosophy, but not looking at it as he said, and I stand corrected, I still privately think it's the piece, one of the missing pieces. But if we look at it from just a neutral place, how do you think a philosophy like that, and maybe other similar philosophies, can be integrated in a way that can support different countries based on their individual needs?
Well, I think, from what the ambassador said, clearly some other countries have been interested. I guess you would say that the SEP is not something that is very widely known, would you say? Certainly when we started this work, it was news to me. I hadn't heard of it previously. I'm not a Thailand specialist at all, but it wasn't something that was out there in a big way across the world. So I think there's probably an issue about who knows about it, for starters.
But even similar, it doesn't have to be an SCP philosophy. What my question is to you is, do you think things that are more people-centered, I guess what I'm trying to say, more people-centered philosophies are the philosophies that will work?
I would hope so. Otherwise we're a bit doomed, actually. If we can't get people-centered and environment-centered, nature-centered philosophies to work, then we don't have a huge amount of hope. But I think you also are asking a very practical question, which is how these philosophies which give more balance, more weight, if you like, to the environmental and the social, as well as the economic, how they can come into play. And I think that's why we're doing the research, really, because we want to try and find out. We want a theory of change which tells us how we can get to that point. And I guess what I would say at the moment is that there are different ways of getting to that point from what we have seen. But it's not easy. It's a really challenging pathway. And I think the SDGs, are provide a great route map, but the pathway is not always very clear. And I think it's that finding that practical pathway. So as I mentioned, sometimes it will get taken up as a political issue, probably quite rarely, unless there's a lot of pressure. But certain agencies can be really important. In Thailand, it was the king. In Kenya, the constitution has actually played a huge role in the new constitution that was developed around 2010, has played a huge role in, if you like, setting the scene for a reasonably progressive policy agenda. In the Dominican Republic, it was also a constitutional reform. And then, we've heard how crises can generate some enthusiasm for more joined-up thinking. You need forces behind it to push it. It's not going to happen by itself. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah. Okay, so, just 1 minute. Perfect timing. Well, first of all, I have to admit that it has been such a rich and diverse discussion. I promise I won't make the effort to summarize what have been discussed. And all I want to say is that I think that we have heard both conceptual thinking and exploration of ideas to promote a more inclusive, sustainable transformation and how we do it, as well as some practical examples that give us hope that there are ways we can look forward to. And I think that the final words is that I like the analogy the ambassador used, the three-dimensional chess game, right? So it's not just science fiction, it's actually our reality. We have to find a solution to this three-dimensional chess game, which is not going to be easy. But I'm very glad that today we started, sharing, on this occasion, we share some ideas and some research, and we look forward to continued exchange, collaboration, whatever is possible, and then we hope to get out of this, with hope. Not we are not doomed.
Right.
That's not the
Thank
message.
You.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank everybody for being here.
Thank you very much.